Hi, I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell, and I want to thank you for taking the time to watch my videos. In this series of videos, I've been doing an analysis on Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And I've been going through this text. The particular one that I have is the 30th anniversary edition, but I've been going through detailed, section by section, page by page analysis of Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and I'm going to continue that analysis today. In the discussion today, we're going to talk about some of the failures that the oppressors have and the likelihood of what's known as converts, people who were oppressors joining members of the oppressed in their attempt to achieve liberation. With that being said, I'm going to continue the discussion. Also, before I forget, again, the notes that I'm using for the lecture are accessible. Just click the banner below or click the link in the description box. I'll be adding to the growing PDF as the lectures continue until I finish the book. Again, if you don't want to listen to the lectures, you can access the notes. If you don't want to read the notes, then thank you for watching the videos. With that being said, let's begin. Okay, so this is Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And what I'm going to do is begin by discussing some of the failures of the oppressors. So this is the failures of the oppressors. Alright, let's see what some of these failures are that the oppressors have. The first thing that we should recognize is a quote that Freire offers. He says the following, and this is a quote from page 58 of the book that I showed you earlier. If having is a condition for being, if possessing, material possession, if having, ownership, is a condition for being, it is a necessary condition for all. Right? If we are going to make the argument that possession is a condition for existence, ownership is a position for existence, then it is not only the possession that those who have defines existence, but everyone needs to have possession, right? And that's obviously not what's being argued. What's being argued by the oppressor is the following, right? The oppressor says that, as oppressor, that there's an object in the world, and here's the oppressed group on a lower level than the oppressor, right? So you have the oppressor, you have the oppressed, and what the oppressor says is that I have access to this object. This object is mine. And the possession of that object defines who I am, defines my being. Well, what Freire says is if this idea of having is a condition for existence and a condition for being, it is a necessary condition for all, which means that there would have to be this competition, and this is exactly what the oppressor doesn't want. The oppressor wants to keep the oppressed in an oppressed class by divorcing the oppressed from an opportunity of having, right? So that ownership only becomes viable, only becomes an option for those of the oppressor class, and the oppressed are incapable of gaining access to ownership because ownership is dominated by the oppressor class. Okay, we'll revisit this idea of having and ownership in a minute, and as we've already seen, Freire doesn't give primacy to the idea of ownership. He believes that insofar as we evoke the idea of ownership, we also evoke the idea of oppression and violence, because one, I'm going to have to protect that which I own, and two, that which I own needs to be maintained, and I'm not going to maintain it, others must maintain it, others beneath me. Right? So we already know how, based on the previous lectures, how Freire feels specifically about the idea of ownership. The next point that he brings up is that the oppressor, right? Oppressors fail to recognize their privilege in having, right? This ability to possess an object, to have an object, to call an object yours or mine, is a privilege, right? The idea that I can claim ownership to an object is a privilege, which they do not recognize as a privilege, right? Which only makes it that much more problematic. The ability, for example, the ability for most Americans to live the life that they live is a privileged lifestyle. Go anywhere outside of the United States of America, go to any third world country, the idea of having water accessible in your refrigerator, right, in a bottled form, or a filter on your faucet for clean drinking water at your disposal is something that every single American takes for granted, for the most part, even myself. We take it for granted. Yeah, there should be water accessible for drinking at any moment that I want. In other parts of the world, in many other parts of the world, people have to walk tens of miles to arrive at a place where they can get clean drinking water. And the trek to get the clean drinking water and the trek back is itself fraught with hazards, right? So what we have to recognize, right, and all Freire is saying is that what we should do is recognize our privilege in the ability of having. Obviously, the oppressor doesn't want to make this recognition. We assume that it's there for me to have, right? And if anyone were to challenge my ability to have that, then there would be conflict between me and this individual. What Freire is saying is that it's not inherent, right? This having isn't something that you have to, that's inherent in our existence as human beings. It's a privilege, right? It's a consequence of privilege. And we should at least acknowledge that privilege, right? So the fact that you can, at 3 o'clock in the morning, wake up out of your bed, walk into your kitchen, open up your refrigerator door, grab a bottle of water, drink a bottle of water, throw the plastic in the garbage, the non-recycled garbage, is something that's privileged, right? And we should at least acknowledge our privilege in that regard. And I think he's absolutely right. All right, point number 2. A failure to recognize this privilege, right? Failing to recognize this privilege further dehumanizes the oppressed, right? So the failure to recognize this privilege becomes the dehumanization of the oppressed, right? If I don't recognize that I am privileged, for example, in my ability to go out and grab bottled water from my refrigerator at any time that I want and consume it, when I go abroad, if I recognize then that, hey, where's all the bottled water? I'm thirsty. Can somebody get me something to drink? And they're like, oh, we don't have it now. And I say, oh, I can't believe you guys don't have this. How could you live in a place that doesn't have bottled water easily accessible? This is where you get sort of the idea that Americans aren't the best tourists, right? The French say this about Americans quite often. Whether it's true or not is aside from the point. But the whole point is that we have to recognize the privilege that we have in the States, and not just the States, just any privileged class needs to recognize the privilege that they have and always take that into account when traveling or when interacting with others who don't have that privilege. If I flaunt this privilege that I have, right? If I knowingly flaunt this privilege that I have with a member of an oppressed class that does not have access, right? The access has been barred, right? That from a member of an oppressed class that does not have access to that thing, then what am I doing? I'm dehumanizing the individual of the oppressed class. I know that you don't have access to the thing that I do have access to, and I'm flaunting my access, right? That flaunting of access dehumanizes the other because I recognize that you don't have it and I do, right? The last video series ended with the idea of the haves and have-nots, and this is a consequence of that idea of have and have-nots. The third point goes, makes the case even further, right? Having, owning, possessing. The belief, right? The belief that the oppressor has, right, is the following, right? That having, owning, possessing, right? Having, owning, and possessing are inalienable rights, right? It is an inalienable right. The oppressor believes that as an oppressor class, we have the inalienable right, right? A right which cannot be challenged, a right which cannot be contested, a right which is given by my very existence, right? Remember, it started with an example of being, right? My being necessitates my ability to have, own, and possess, right? If you have the idea that your being, right, is necessitated by this inalienable right to have, own, and possess, what will logically follow is that you're going to believe, right, the oppressor class is going to believe that I have the right to have more, right? So if there are more objects out there, and there always are more things to be consumed, more things to be purchased, more things to own, I want to have a monopoly on all of these things, right? I want to make sure that at all times I have a complete control of all the resources, all the things, quote unquote, out there that are available for purchase. I should have one, right? It should be accessible to me, but not only that I should have one, right? It's not an ethical claim. It's not saying that I would like to have one or that I should have one, but that I must have one, right? It is a requirement. My existence necessitates the fact that I possess that thing, right? And this is a bit far more extreme, right? In the meantime, we see that at every instance, members of the oppressed group are denied, right? Members of the oppressed group are denied access to ownership, and what ends up happening is that denial, that inability to own, while others in the oppressor class can own, further dehumanizes those of the oppressed group.